It is Tuesday night, just 90 minutes before a deadline that could have redrawn the entire Middle East. American B-52 bombers and the heaviest long-range strike aircraft in the United States arsenal are already in the air. Their targets are set: Iranian power plants, Iranian bridges, civilian infrastructure. The pilots have their orders. The machinery of escalation is already moving. And then the phone rings. Within hours, the bombers are gone. They turn back. They head home. No strikes, no firestorm, no cities collapsing into darkness, no civilization dying in flames. So what happened? And more importantly, what does that moment mean for the next 2 weeks, for the global economy, and for a world that came terrifyingly close to a point it may never have recovered from? Because what unfolded in those hours was not a routine diplomatic pause. It was one of the most consequential reversals in recent geopolitical history. And to understand where this goes next, you have to see the full stage clearly. This war, and yes, we need to call it a war, began on February 28, 2026. That's when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under what's been called Operation Epic Fury. The targets included military facilities, nuclear sites, and Iranian leadership. That's not a skirmish. That's not an airstrike. That was the opening of a war. And Iran's response was immediate, dramatic, and strategically devastating. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. If you don't fully grasp what that means, let me put the numbers in front of you right now. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that narrow passage flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. That's approximately 20% of all global seaborne oil trade. It's where the Gulf's energy exports funnel into the rest of the world. And when Iran shut it down, they didn't just cut off oil. They triggered what the International Energy Agency has officially called, in their own words, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That's not an exaggeration. That's the IEA. That's the institution that monitors global energy markets as its core function. And they're saying this is unprecedented. Bigger than the 1,973 Yom Kippur War. Bigger than the 1,979 Iranian Revolution. Bigger than anything we have seen in the history of modern energy markets. Brent crude surged. It passed $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. It peaked at $126 per barrel. Analysts at Bloomberg were running models showing prices could hit $200 a barrel if the closure extended through Q2. The Dallas Fed published research projecting that a quarter-long Hormuz closure would lower global real GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points on an annualized basis. UNCTAD, the United Nations Trade and Development Agency, warned of cascading impacts on food prices, fertilizer supply, and aviation. Gulf states like Kuwait and Qatar began facing what economists called a grocery supply emergency, with 70% of their food imports disrupted by mid-March. And this wasn't just an oil problem. This was an everything problem. According to the World Economic Forum, beyond crude oil, the Strait carries roughly a third of global seaborne methanol trade, nearly half of all global sulfur exports, and significant volumes of aluminum, helium, fertilizers, and the petroleum coke that feeds electric vehicle battery manufacturing. The Philippines implemented a temporary 4-day working week to manage fuel costs. Airlines were rerouting flights around the Middle East, adding hours to journeys and burning more fuel. Major shipping companies, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, had already suspended Middle East routes entirely. The Stimson Center described the Strait of Hormuz not as a tactical lever, but as, and this is their phrasing, a transmission belt between regional war and the global economy. That's the lens through which you have to understand everything that happened Tuesday night. Now, before we go deeper into the mechanics of this deal, let's talk about the 48 hours that led to the ceasefire, because this wasn't a clean diplomatic resolution. It was chaotic, last minute, and full of contradictions that are still playing out right now as I record this. In the days before the deadline, the pressure was extraordinary. President Trump had been issuing increasingly extreme warnings via Truth Social. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, he posted, and I'll read this because the tone matters. Tuesday will be power plant day and bridge day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the Strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. That's a sitting president of the United States writing that on social media. The escalation was real, and the deadline was real. But inside the White House, there was a split. On one side, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Senator Lindsey Graham, all pushing Trump to reject any deal unless Iran made major concessions up front. On the other side, Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, all advising Trump to take a deal if one was reachable. And then Pakistan stepped in. This is the detail that tends to get glossed over, and it shouldn't. Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir personally reached out to President Trump. They proposed a framework, a 2-week ceasefire during which Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and both sides would enter formal negotiations. Trump confirmed in his announcement, and I'll quote him directly here, that he agreed to suspend strikes on Iran based on conversations with Prime Minister Sharif and Field Marshal Munir, who requested he hold off on the destructive force being sent that night. Pakistan is not an obvious mediator in a U.S.-Iran conflict, but they had both the motivation and the access. Pakistan relies heavily on Gulf oil imports. Their economy had been hammered by the Hormuz closure, and they had credibility with both parties. This is geopolitical improvisation, messy, human, real. And it worked. Now let's get into the precise mechanics of what was agreed, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. On the U.S. side, Trump announced a 2-week suspension of strikes on Iran. In his Truth Social post, he described it as a double-sided ceasefire. He stated the U.S. had met and exceeded all military objectives. He acknowledged receiving a 10-point proposal from Iran and called it, and again quoting him, a workable basis on which to negotiate. He was careful not to say he was accepting the 10-point plan, just that it was a foundation for talks. On the Iranian side, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi confirmed the deal in a statement issued on behalf of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He confirmed that if attacks on Iran were halted, Iranian armed forces would cease their defensive operations. He confirmed that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible during the 2-week period, but with a critical caveat. He specified, via coordination with Iranian armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. What are those technical limitations? Sea mines. During the conflict, Iranian forces laid mines across sections of the strait. They cannot all be located and removed quickly. So Iran is essentially saying ships can pass, but only through corridors we designate and coordinate. Given that over 100 ships transited the strait daily before the war, and the total for the entire past month was barely 100 ships combined, you can already see the bottleneck forming. And then the ceasefire promptly showed its first fractures. Within minutes of the announcement, missiles were launched from Iran toward Israel. One was intercepted on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Iranian naval forces also reportedly halted oil tanker traffic through the strait again, hours after the first tankers had been allowed through, citing Israel's continued strikes in Lebanon. Persian Gulf states, Bahrain, the UAE, and Kuwait reported new Iranian attacks on oil sites. Iran's parliament speaker accused the United States of violating 3 points of the agreement: the ceasefire in Lebanon, a drone entering Iranian airspace, and the denial of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. Here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that requires you to think carefully about how ceasefires actually work. The disconnect between what Iran's leadership agreed to and what Iran's military forces were actually doing isn't necessarily bad faith at the top. It reflects something much more structurally significant. The wave of assassinations throughout this conflict, targeting Iranian commanders, IRGC leadership, and naval officers, has severely degraded Iran's chain of command. The Iranian military is, in some meaningful sense, operating in compartmentalized cells that aren't always receiving or processing orders from the top with speed or clarity. We saw this during what analysts called the 1-2-day war last year. Ceasefires get announced. Lower-level units with access to launch systems keep firing anyway. It doesn't mean the deal is dead. It means the implementation will be messy and contested. This is exactly why Vice President Vance characterized the situation as a fragile truce. He told reporters the ceasefire won't hold if the Strait remains closed, while simultaneously acknowledging that he was already seeing signs of increased traffic. He said plainly, "If we don't see the Strait reopening, the president is not going to abide by our terms." That's a very specific ultimatum tied to a very specific deliverable. And as of right now, the situation is ambiguous. There's also the Lebanon problem. And this is the most politically explosive piece of the entire puzzle. Israel and Iran have been fighting a separate but connected war. Israel has invaded southern Lebanon and has been conducting sustained airstrikes targeting Hezbollah, Iran's most significant proxy force. Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif publicly stated the ceasefire covered Lebanon too. Iranian negotiators appear to have understood Lebanon to be included, but the White House stated clearly, Lebanon is not part of this agreement. Netanyahu confirmed his government would comply with the ceasefire in Iran, but continue striking Lebanon. So you have a situation where the mediator says one thing, one party believes one thing, and the other party's position is something else entirely. European leaders, Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, and Canada, issued a joint statement calling on all sides to implement the ceasefire, including in Lebanon. The EU's Ursula von der Leyen called it a potential solution to what she warned could become a severe global energy crisis. But that joint statement has no enforcement mechanism. It's a plea, not a guarantee. And we need to talk about the 10-point proposal, because this document is the key to understanding where the next 2 weeks go. Iran's 10-point proposal, as laid out through Iranian state media, is extraordinarily ambitious. Point 1. Iran wants guarantees it will not be attacked again. Point 2. A permanent end to the war, not a ceasefire. A permanent end. Point 3. An end to Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Point 4. Lifting of all U.S. sanctions on Iran. Point 5. An end to all regional fighting against Iranian allies. Point 6. In return, Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz. Point 7. Iran would impose a Hormuz transit fee of $2 million per ship. Point 8. Oman would share in those fees. Point 9. Iran would provide rules of safe passage through Hormuz. Point 10. Hormuz fees would be used for reconstruction, not reparations. Now, 7 is the one that will generate the most friction in negotiations. $2 million per ship. That sounds almost modest when you're talking about very large crude carriers, but the precedent it sets is extraordinary. If Iran charges a fee to traverse an international strait, what stops Denmark from charging ships through the Danish Straits? What stops Spain from levying fees in the Strait of Gibraltar? This would be reversing literally 2 centuries of maritime freedom of navigation norms. The world moved away from this model for a reason, and Iran knows they're unlikely to get it. The strategic value of 7 is as a bargaining chip, something they'll sacrifice in exchange for concessions they actually want more. The White House's official position is that they've accepted none of the 10 points. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the original 10-point plan was, quoting here, literally thrown in the garbage by President Trump and his negotiating team. So there's already a fundamental dispute between what Iran says was agreed and what Washington acknowledges. This mirrors every major ceasefire in history. Both sides frame the moment as their victory. Iran state media is broadcasting internally that U.S. bombers turned around because Iran held firm. U.S. media is reporting that America's military campaign created the leverage for diplomatic success. Both narratives are politically necessary. Neither is fully accurate. Here's where it gets interesting. At the negotiating table, talks are expected to begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. VP Vance is expected to lead the U.S. delegation. Iran's delegation will reportedly be led by Foreign Minister Araghchi and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. Pakistan hosts. And the two most contentious issues on the table are also the two issues where the gap between the parties is widest. First, Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Trump hardened his position late Wednesday, saying there will be no uranium enrichment, full stop. But Iran's 10-point proposal reportedly includes acceptance of enrichment as a baseline requirement. The King's College London associate professor Andreas Krieg told Al Jazeera that the enrichment question is exactly what caused the previous round of negotiations to collapse in February. Iran views enrichment as a sovereign right. The U.S. views enrichment continuation as an existential proliferation risk. There is no obvious middle ground here. Second, U.S. sanctions. Iran wants all sanctions lifted. That's a non-starter in the current political environment without extraordinary concessions in return. The Trump administration has signaled it might discuss tariff and sanctions relief, but within a framework of verifiable Iranian compliance on nuclear and military limits. Iran will want those limits minimized. The U.S. will want them maximized and verified. This is a negotiation that could take months, not days. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas researchers put it in stark economic terms. Their modeling showed that even a single quarter of Hormuz closure could lower global GDP growth by nearly 3 percentage points annualized. Oil had already surged to $126 a barrel at peak. The ceasefire news sent crude prices plunging, dropping below $100 a barrel almost immediately after the announcement. Global stock markets surged. S&P futures indicated a more than 2% jump at open. The market was pricing in relief, but that relief is premised on a ceasefire that is already showing cracks. This brings us to the journalist release, because it's a piece of the story that deserves more attention than it's getting. American journalist Shelley Kittleson had been kidnapped a week prior in Baghdad, Iraq, by an Iran-backed Iraqi Shia militia, reportedly Kataib Hezbollah, not to be confused with Lebanese Hezbollah. She was abducted by a group operating inside Iraq with Iranian backing, and critically, she was released before the ceasefire announcement was made. According to Fox News, and confirmed by the State Department, her release was the result of intensive behind-the-scenes work by the Iraqi government operating separately from the main Iran-U.S. negotiations. This matters because it tells us something about the Iraqi government's capacity and motivation to act as an independent diplomatic player, not just a proxy battlefield for Iranian influence. Iraq doesn't want this war. They're absorbing collateral damage daily. And when they had the ability to move quietly and resolve one piece of this crisis, they did it. Now let's zoom out, because to understand why Iran is negotiating the way it's negotiating, you have to understand a history that goes much, much further back than February 28, 2026. The Strait of Hormuz has been at the center of Iranian strategic thinking for decades. This isn't new. Iran's ability to threaten the Strait has historically been both its greatest leverage point and its greatest vulnerability. Its leverage because it can cause enormous pain globally, almost immediately. Its vulnerability because actually closing the strait also devastates Iran's own oil revenues. Iran needs to export oil. Every day the strait is closed is also a day Iran is hemorrhaging income. The pattern of escalation and de-escalation in the strait goes back to the tanker war of the 1980s, when the U.S. military actually had to escort oil tankers through Gulf waters under Operation Earnest Will. The current situation has echoes of that period, but the scale is different. Global interdependence is different. And the military capabilities on all sides, including drone warfare, precision strikes, and the ability to mine and demine waterways, are categorically different from anything seen in that era. What makes this ceasefire structurally fragile is precisely what makes it significant. For the first time, Iran's Supreme National Security Council has formally acknowledged the ceasefire and confirmed a willingness to negotiate based on a U.S.-originated proposal framework. Iran's supreme leader has personally approved the deal. That's not nothing. In the internal politics of the Iranian regime, that level of explicit top-level endorsement matters. Even if the military chain of command is fractured, even if lower-level units keep firing, The political legitimacy of this ceasefire at the highest level of Iranian authority is real. And the question that matters most right now, the question that every energy market analyst, every diplomat, every government in Asia and Europe is watching, is whether the Strait can functionally reopen in a way that allows shipping to resume. The technical picture is complicated. Beyond the mines, there's the matter of insurance. Major shipping companies have been operating under war risk insurance provisions that essentially make Hormuz transits commercially prohibitive. Those provisions don't disappear because a ceasefire was announced on Tuesday night. They require documented stability, consistent safe passage, and confidence that Iranian naval forces won't revert to their previous behavior of targeting vessels. According to CNBC, that process of restoring commercial shipping confidence could take weeks, even under the best-case scenario. The backlog is extraordinary. Before the war, over 100 ships were transiting the Strait daily. During the past month of conflict, the total count was barely that across the entire period. That's roughly 3 ships per day, instead of over 100. You have tankers queued in the Gulf of Oman. You have crude oil sitting in Saudi and Kuwaiti storage that producers need to move. And now you're going to route it all through lanes constrained by Iranian mine clearance requirements. The congestion is going to be significant, even in the best case. And here's the bigger picture reality that every government watching this ceasefire needs to sit with. This is not a peace deal. This is not even close to a peace deal. As analyst Rob Pinfold told Al Jazeera, all sides have basically agreed to disagree and kick their core disagreements into the long grass. The enrichment question, the sanctions question, the regional proxy forces question, the normalization of Iranian sovereignty over maritime traffic, which is what their 10-point plan is effectively demanding, none of these issues have been resolved. None of them will be resolved in 2 weeks. They may not be resolvable in 2 years. What this ceasefire is a pause. A critically important pause. A pause that prevents what could have been an irreversible military escalation tonight. A pause that gives the global economy a window to breathe. A pause that gives diplomats a table to sit at. The G7 nations plus EU leadership, calling it a potential solution to a severe global energy crisis, are right, but only if the pause becomes something more durable, and that is not guaranteed. So, what do we watch for in the coming days? Watch the Strait. Not just whether ships are moving. Watch what kinds of ships, under what conditions, and under whose coordination. If Iran is demanding Iranian armed forces coordination for every vessel, that's not freedom of navigation. That's Iranian sovereignty over international waters. The White House has already said that Iran charging tolls would be considered a limitation violating the deal's terms. These two positions are not yet reconciled. Watch Lebanon. Israel has been explicit. The ceasefire does not cover Lebanon. Iran and Pakistan believe it does. If Israeli strikes in Lebanon continue at their current intensity, Iran's military factions will use that as justification to resume attacks, possibly regardless of what their political leadership in Tehran has agreed to. That Lebanon variable could unravel this deal faster than any other single factor. Watch Islamabad. The talks beginning Friday, April 10th, will be the first real test of whether there is a genuine negotiating path here. Vance leading the U.S. delegation is significant. It signals this is a priority at the highest level of the executive branch. But the Iranian delegation's instructions, the gaps between the 10-point and 15-point proposals, and the nuclear enrichment red line are all enormous obstacles that haven't moved. And watch the markets. Oil below $100 is the market's verdict on cautious optimism. If Hormuz traffic resumes meaningfully, prices fall further. If it stalls, if a new attack occurs, if Lebanon triggers a collapse of the ceasefire framework, prices spike back toward that $126 peak very fast. The Dallas Fed's modeling is clear on the GDP consequences of an extended closure. The world economy cannot absorb a Q2 closure of the Hormuz Strait without entering what analysts are already calling a potential stagflationary shock. The bottom line is this: Tuesday night's ceasefire is real. The planes turned around. The bombs didn't fall. The Strait is, for now, nominally open to coordinated passage. An American journalist is free, and two of the most consequential adversaries in the global energy system are sitting down at a table in Islamabad in less than 48 hours to try to figure out if there is a world in which this war permanently ends. That's not nothing. That's actually remarkable, given where we were 72 hours ago when Trump was posting about civilizations dying and Iranian students were forming human shields around power plants. But let's be clear-eyed. This is fragile. VP Vance used that exact word, fragile, and fragile things break. The ceasefire has already been tested by post-announcement missile launches, Hormuz reclosure reports, Lebanese strike continuations, and a fundamental dispute between the two parties about what exactly they agreed to. The next 2 weeks are going to tell us whether the world's most consequential military conflict of 2026 has found a genuine off-ramp, or whether Tuesday night was simply the pause before the next escalation. We're going to keep covering this in real time. Every development, every negotiating shift, every market signal, every escalation, you'll hear about it here first. If you're not subscribed to yet, now is genuinely the moment. Hit subscribe.